Hello and welcome back to Economics with Professor Klein at Cuesta College. Topic of this video is cross-price elasticity, to continue our discussion of elasticity. And so similar to the other definitions that we've been talking about, elasticity is always the measure of quantity demanded to a change in either price or income. So when we're back to cross-price elasticity, it's going to be back to the change in the price. And the reason why it's called cross-price is because we're going to look at the relationship between two goods. So again, when we were talking about factors that shift demand, and we talked about the price of a substitute good or the price of a complementary good, this is how we can actually gather data and test whether two goods are substitutes, complements, or unrelated. So similar to our others, we always want to put quantity demanded in the numerator. So we'll start off with our midpoint method, all right? And so we're going to do the quantity demanded of, in this case, good A, right? Or you could say good B, and subtract what's going to happen. And I'm just going to label 1 and 2 so that we know whether it's the first or the second. And again, these don't matter as long as I match them with the price of 1 and 2. All right, so again, it's going to be the halfway point between these two. That's our numerator. And then price, I'm going to put the price of B2 minus the price of B1, and again, the halfway. So the easiest way to understand these a lot of times is with an example. So let's go over an example. Now, we're going to find that the most important thing with cross-price elasticity is simply the sign. And usually it goes contrary to how you are expecting. But I'll prove it with an example. Let's say that the price of movies, so I'm going to call movies B. Price of movies, when it's $10, we're going to look at the quantity demanded of popcorn, right? And so when the price of movies is $10, the movie theater sells 80 bags of popcorn, right? 80 units of popcorn. When the price of movies is $12, right? So if you just think about this, movies and popcorn, what type of goods are these? Am I replacing popcorn with movies, or am I tending to combine these and consume them together? And the answer is they tend to be consumed together, not in place of each other. So we're expecting them to be complementary goods. So if the price of movies goes up, what do we think will happen to popcorn? Well, now we can actually test it and observe it, right? And so if we observe that the popcorn drops, right? If people only buy 64 units of popcorn now that the price of movies is $12, this is how we're going to prove that they're complements, right? And so as we plug them in, this is particularly important. Make sure that wherever we plug 12, 64 goes with it. So if I plug in 12 first, sorry, price is in the denominator. So I'm going to start with 80 minus 64. And again, it doesn't matter as long as now that I'm starting with 80, let's make sure we start with 10. The reason why is that the sign matters. And anytime the sign matters, you have to make sure that the information is being entered the same time, right? So if I start with information about $10, then I need to start with the information about 80 units of popcorn. So the difference, and then the halfway point. And we'll come back and we'll simplify that in just a moment. And so if I start with 80, right, then I need to start with 10 and subtract 12. And then again, the halfway point. So we'll come back to this in just a moment. So let's start to simplify. So 80 minus 64, that's 16. If you need a calculator for that, that's fine. No big deal. And then halfway between 80 and 64, well, if that's 16, halfway would be 8 plus or minus. So you can either add 8 to here or subtract it from here. It's probably easier to subtract it from 80. So we have 72. And then we'll see that both of these can be divided by 9. Sorry, 8. I skipped ahead. So that's going to be 2 16, there's 2 8s and 16, and then 72 divided by 8 is 9. So now we have simplified our numerator, right? Now, here's where we have to be careful. 80 minus 64 is a positive number. 10 minus 12 is negative 2. And it's that negative that is important, right? That's actually the most important part about solving this equation. Halfway between 10 and 12 is 11. So positive number, negative number, positive number. If you have an odd negative number, if you have 1 negative or 3 negatives or 5 negatives, your overall number will be negative, right? And so what we're going to find, and I'll come and simplify this in just a moment, when cross price elasticity is negative, right? When it's less than 0, that means we have a complementary good. As we've just shown, as the price of movies go up, people buy less popcorn. Why? Well, now they have to spend more on movies, so they're either less willing or less able to buy popcorn. And so this shows us that they tend to go together, right? What if it's instead positive number? Well, if it's positive, then that's going to be a substitute. Now, the last thing to mention here is that not all goods are complements and substitutes. And so the magnitude matters because if it's really close to 0, if this is a weak number, then there is a weak relationship and they may not be related at all, right? So this is where we do have to use some of our common sense. And so again, we could plug in, the price of basketballs goes up and the price of bunny slippers falls. Well, we wouldn't expect them to be related goods, right? We would have to use a little bit of common sense there. So it does matter what we're looking at, and the more information we have, the better off we are at estimating what's going on. And so as we come back and finish this up, so in order to get rid of the 2/11ths, I'm going to multiply by negative 11 over 2. That's going to make that just 1. So I'm going to multiply by negative 11 over 2, right? And so this cancels. And so my answer, sorry, it's a little crowded over there, is negative 11 over 9. And so this is, if we ignore the negative here, it's a number that's bigger than 1, right? And so magnitude matters. The larger this is away from 0, the stronger relationship there is between these two items, right? So if this was instead, if we had found a number and I told you that I'll just eliminate this. If I simply told you the cross price elasticity was found to be 0.05, right? Well, technically, if it's positive, they would be a substitute. But with such a small number, right, we would want to know what those two items are because really it looks more like they're completely unrelated. So the closer it is to 0, and I'm just going to put approximately, the closer it is to 0, the more likely they are unrelated, that there is no relationship between the two goods, right? So not everything has to have a complement, not everything has to have a substitute. In fact, clean water, there is no substitute, right? And that's where a lot of marketing campaigns, they try to come in and tell you that there is no substitute for their good, right? So the negative here is what gives us the most information. The fact that it's negative tells us that it is a complementary good. And the larger that this number is in total, ignoring the negative, the more related, the more strongly related these two goods are. All right, I hope that helps. And hopefully this will help you complete your homework and be ready for the exam. Have a good one.